Welcome back and welcome to part 4 and the final part of this Rocky River nature animation tutorial series. So this is the final part, so in this part we're going to be doing the animation, we'll render the scene, do the compositing, render out the frames, and then we'll compile the frames together and add the sound effects to get the final video. Now one small detail which I forgot to do in the previous part is to make sure that this empty object here is in the main collection. So if I go back to solid view, we used this empty to tell the camera where it's going to focus on. So if you select the empty, you can just press the M key and we're just going to stick it here in the collection. And we want to make sure it's in this collection, not the medium and the small rocks, because we don't want to distribute it with the other rocks on the scene. So let's start by animating the water. So I'll just select the water object and we'll go here to the shading workspace. So we're going to be using this mapping node to rotate the noise texture, and that'll make the noise go down along the river and make it look like the ripples are moving. And then we're also going to animate this W value on the noise texture to make the water kind of be randomized. So to preview it better, I'm going to Control Shift and select the noise texture so that we can see it a little bit better. So I now want to split the window, so I'll just click here on the corner and I'm just going to drag down to split the window, and then we just want to change this window, so I'll click here and I'll change this to the timeline, and then I want to be able to see the timeline going all the way over. So here in the corner you can click and drag over and then let go, and that'll just split it. So now we have a timeline that we can animate with. So I'm going to start by going to frame 0 and I'll go back into rendered mode just so I can see the noise. So on the mapping behind the noise texture, we can take the rotation X value and we can turn this into the negative values. And you can see if I do that, it's basically rotating the noise texture. And so it looks like it is moving down the river. So make sure the timeline is at 0. And then to add a keyframe to the rotation X, you can hover your mouse over the value and press the I key. So I now want to go to the end of the animation, and you could of course make the animation as long as you want. I want the animation to be 10 seconds long, and in 24 frames per second, 250 frames is 10 seconds. So if you just click right here, we're just going to type 251 to go 1 frame after the end frame. And we can now just rotate the rotation X into the negative values. Now you might need to play around with this depending on the size of your scene and depending on how fast you want the water to move. But for my scene, I've found that just a -6 works pretty good. So I'll turn it to -6 and then add another keyframe with the I key. Now, if you can't see the keyframes right down here on the timeline, make sure you select the mapping node and make sure you select the correct object. And also you might need to click with your middle mouse wheel and drag up to see the keyframes. So now there's 2 keyframes, but right now it's going to start very slow and then it's going to speed up. So just select all the keyframes in the timeline and you can use the T key, and we're just going to use the linear interpolation. So that way the animation will move at the same speed. So you can see we now have just a nice slow moving river. Now you can see the noise isn't changing that much. It is moving, but it's not changing that much. So we're going to use the noise texture W value to randomize it. So right here, if you click on this, we'll change it to 0 to go to the starting frame. And then the W value, use the I key to add a keyframe there. And then right here on the active frame, we can again type in 251 so we go back to the end. And then I want to change the noise texture W value. And again, you might need to play around with this value so that it looks good for your scene. But for my scene, I found that turning the W value to a 0.06 is pretty good. So after 250 frames, it'll be at 0.06. And then again, add another keyframe there with the I key. And then select the noise texture. And you want to, again, press the A key, make sure the keyframes are selected. And we'll use the T key and we'll just make sure the keyframe interpolation is linear. So now if I play this, not only is the water moving, if I just kind of go up here to the top, you can see the noise is randomly changing and it's also moving. So that is very cool. So I can preview the bump just to see what the bump is looking like. That's pretty cool. And then I can preview the principled shader, and that is looking pretty cool. Now it is really noisy because it's playing, but if I just pause this, you can kind of see what that's doing. So that is the animation for the river. It's really quite simple. I'm now going to be animating the camera. So let's select the camera and I'll just jump back right over here to the layout. So I'm first going to move the camera back a little bit. So I'll move it back. I'm just going to bring it back kind of to about there. Maybe also rotate it over a little bit. Just kind of get it to a nice starting position. And then here on the active frames, let's turn this again to 0. So the blue line there is at 0. Now I'm going to turn on the auto key by clicking on this little button right here. That'll automatically add a keyframe every time we make a transform. So then we just can move the camera by hitting G and then clicking, and that'll add a keyframe right there. You can see there's the yellow diamond. So we can now go to the very end. So again, here on the active frame, let's just change this to 251. So that's one frame after the end frame, and then we can move this. So let's just move the camera over, and again, to move the camera in and out, after you hit G, you can tap the Z key twice, and that'll move the camera in and out. So I'm just going to bring it in, and I might want to rotate this down, so after I hit R, I can double tap X, maybe rotate that down, bring it forward a little bit, and I don't want to move the camera too much, but just a little bit. So now I can play the animation, we can kind of see how that's looking, and then again, with the keyframe selected, using the T key, we'll just use the linear again, so that it is a consistent speed. And I think that's actually moving a little bit too much, so an easy way to slow down the camera is to simply just select this keyframe here, and you can just hit G to grab, just like moving any other object, and you can move the keyframe around. So if you just bring the keyframe way over here to like 300 or 400, now you can see it's going to be even slower. Now I want to make the camera's animation feel a bit more organic, so I'm going to add a very subtle handheld effect. Basically, the camera is just going to randomly rotate a little bit and move around and look like it's a little bit handheld and make it look a bit bumpy. So let's select the camera, and then we want to split the window. So we'll click here in the corner to split the window, and here on the editor type, we can change this to the graph editor. Let's make this smaller so I can see it a bit better. So if the camera's selected, you can see the different keyframes, and if this side panel here isn't open, then you can click here to drag it open. And there is the camera, and then if you open up the arrow, here are all of the transforms of the camera. Now we're first going to click on the top one here, which is the X location, and then we can add a modifier to that keyframe. So we'll go to the modifiers, we can add a modifier, and we can add a noise. So it's going to add noise to those keyframes. So now if I play this, you can see the camera's all bumpy. Now that is way too bumpy, so we can change the scale and the strength. So for my scene, I find that a scale value of 60 works pretty well. And then for the strength, I've found that a 0.02 works pretty good. So if you look closely at the camera, kind of look here on the side, you can see it is wobbling around just a little bit, but it's extremely subtle. But we're going to be adding it to all the locations and all the rotations of the camera, and that way you'll be able to see it a bit better. So we have added it to the X location because we had the X location selected, and you can see it looks a little bit wobbly here in the graph editor. So to copy this noise to the other locations and rotations, we can click on this button here just to copy it. So click on that button, then you can click on the Y location, you can click on this button here to paste it. And then because we've already copied it, we can just click on the Z, click on the paste button, click on the X rotation, and then click on the paste button, click on the Y rotation, click on the paste button, and the last one here, the Z rotation, click on the paste button. So now if you click through all the rotations and the locations on this side panel, they all have that noise. You can see the noise is right there. And if I kind of navigate down here to see the other ones, you can see they all have noise. So now if I play through this, I'll just make this a bit smaller so I can see it better. You can see now the camera has a very subtle handheld effect, and it just looks a bit more natural and a bit more organic. So I can close the graph editor by just clicking here in the corner and dragging over, and then just close that. So we're done animating the camera, so I want to make sure to turn off the auto key because I don't accidentally want to add keyframes. So we're almost ready to render the scene and do the compositing, but there is one more thing that I want to do, and that is that I want to add a bit more detail to the environment where the camera can see it better and where it's closer up. So if I just go into the rendered view, let's just see how this is looking. I want to select the environment, and if I go here to the modifier properties, we have the levels viewport at 2, but if I turn this up to 3, and we'll just wait for this to load up, this is going to be the amount of detail it's going to render with. So like right over here, that looks really great. That's pretty high detail, and here you're not able to see that too well because it's kind of blurry, and this is fine as well. However, if I zoom close up here, you can see that actually looks really chunky and it doesn't actually look that realistic. Now we could turn the viewport and render levels up even more, but this would just make it even more laggy and it would make the scene even more dense, and we really don't need that much detail way over here. So what I'm going to do is just subdivide this area where the camera can see it closer up. So I'm going to go to solid view. I'll just select this object and we'll go into edit mode. And then I'll just make sure everything is deselected, and we can just box select any areas that we want to be more detailed. So I'll box select that there. And if you want to, you can box select any other areas that the camera can see, but I'm really just going to box select pretty much this area here because that's where the camera can see most of the detail. So then you can use the object context menu and just click on subdivide, and it's just going to subdivide those faces so now they're even more detailed. And then if you want to do that again, you could just like box select another area, maybe just box select a few more areas, and then again, using the object context menu, you can subdivide that. So now you can see the gravel right next to the river is much more detailed. And I might even do that right over here. So I might like box select these right here and subdivide it again. So this way we're just adding more detail where we need it. So if I now go back into the rendered mode to see how this is looking, if I zoom in here, you can see the gravel looks so much more detailed, but we haven't added tons of extra detail anywhere else. We've just added more detail where the camera is close up and where the camera can see it. All right, so we can now go over the render settings. So I'm first going to go to the output properties, and for my final scene, the final animation that I created, I rendered this at 2560 by 1440. That is 2K resolution. My monitor is 2K resolution, and I also like to upload higher quality videos to YouTube just so it looks really crisp and nice. However, for this tutorial result, I do want it to render a bit faster, so I will turn the resolution back to the default of 1920 on the X and then 1080 on the Y. So that is still a decently high quality image. It's still 1080p, so that's fine, and it'll render a bit faster. And then also right down here, let's go to the output. We want to set an output to render out the frames, so we'll click on this file icon. So then in the folder of my project files, I'll click on the new folder icon, and we can just rename this to frames, and we can then go into the folder, and inside this folder, we'll click on accept. So Blender will render out all the frames to that folder. And then here in the file format, just to make the image size a bit smaller, I'll just turn this to JPEG, but you could totally use PNG if you want to. I'll change it to JPEG, and then the quality, I'll turn that up to 100. So now I want to make the scene so that it renders a bit faster. So let's go here to the render properties. So here on the sampling, I want to open this up, and here on the samples, I'm going to turn the samples up to like 200. So turning the samples up will make it render longer, but the scene will be a bit more crisp. Something that we can do to make it render faster is to turn down the light paths. So let's open up the light paths tab right here, and I'm going to open up the max bounces, and I'm going to turn the total down to 2, the diffuse and the glossy down to 2, and then the transmission, if I turn this all the way down, you can see the river does look slightly different, but if I turn the transmission just up to 1, now you'll be able to see through the river better. So if I kind of zoom in here, if the transmission is 0, the river looks really dark, but we just need the transmission to be to 1 so that we can see through the river. And then there isn't actually any transparency, so we can turn the transparent to 0. And then also this indirect light here, we can turn that to 0. And then it may not make much of a difference because there's nothing moving in the scene very fast, but I am going to be turning on this motion blur just to make it a bit more realistic. And then before we render the scene, I do want to go here to the view layer properties, and I want to open up the passes, and I want to use the denoising data, and we'll be using this in the compositing. So before we render this, just save the project with Control S, and then I just want to render out a single image, so I'll just hit F12. And the shot has rendered, so we'll now do some compositing. So you can click here on the compositing layout, and let's also use the nodes, so we can use the compositing nodes, and we will turn on the backdrop here. So I want to denoise the image, so we'll go to the add menu. I'm going to just search for a denoise, and let's put this right here between the render layers and composite. And I find that if you take the accurate and just change it to fast, it'll denoise a lot faster, but it won't affect the quality. And then to make the denoise work a little bit better, we can put the denoise denoising normal into the normal and the denoising albedo into the albedo, and this will basically just give the denoiser a bit more data to work with. And then we did turn on the node wrangler earlier, so we can just control shift and select the denoise to add the viewer, and we can preview it in the background. And then I also want to add a glare just to add a tiny little bit of a glare to some of the bright areas. So I'm going to search for the glare node, and let's stick this right here on the wire, and we can put the glare image into the composite in viewer. And then I'm going to turn the streaks on the glare to fog glow instead, and then we'll just wait for that to composite. And you can't really see it because there isn't anything which is super bright, so I can turn this threshold down. So I'll start by maybe turning the threshold to just like a 0.3, and there we go. Now you can see a tiny little bit of glare. So kind of here on the end of the rock, that's a bit glowing, and kind of some things here in the background, it's glowing just a tiny bit. All right, so right over here on the output properties, we've already set the output so that it renders out all of the frames to a folder. So again, I always just save the project again, just in case anything crashes, and then we can click on render, and we'll render all of the frames to that folder by clicking render animation. Alright, so the frames have finished rendering. So again, I'll just press Ctrl S and make sure I save this file, and then I'll go File, and I'll go New, and I'm going to open a new video editing. So then here in Blender's video editor, down here in the timeline, go to the Add menu, and I'm going to add Image/Sequence. And then you can just locate to the folder where you saved all the frames and select all the frames with the A key. And then if you click right up here on this arrow, you want to make sure that we sort by name. And that way it's going to start at 1 and 2 and 3, and it'll be in the correct order. So I can now click on Add Image Strip. So then I'll use the spacebar just to play that and check out the final animation. And also right here, you want to make sure the frame rate is the same frame rate that you used in the other blend file. So the default was 24 frames per second. And then also make sure the resolution is the same. And I render this out at 1920 by 1080. So I'm now going to be adding in those sound effects that I talked about at the beginning of the tutorial series. And if you'd like to download the same sound effects that I'm using, they're free sound effects from freesound.org, and I'll have the links in the description. So from my file browser, I'm just going to click and drag and drop in the sound effects. And then with the sound effects selected, I can click on the display waveform so I can see them. And this first one here is the river flowing sound effect. And I'm going to make the volume a little bit quieter so that it's a bit quieter. I just want this one to be pretty quiet. And in the video, you won't be able to hear it just because in my screen recording software, OBS, I have the computer audio turned off just so that any computer audio won't be too loud over my voice. But I just have the river flowing sound effect, and I just turned the volume down. So now I can click and drag, and I can drop in the next sound effect here. This one's the small river, and I can bring this one over. And again, I'll click on the display waveform, and I'm gonna make it much quieter. So maybe I'll turn this up to like a 0.2, maybe a 0.5. So just really listen to the sound effects. You can kind of move them around and get it to how you like. Let's add in the last sound effect. So this is the ones with the forest and the birds. So I'll drop this in here. I can bring it over. And then again, I want to use the display waveform just so I can see it. And I'll turn the volume way down so it's a bit quieter. And then I can just kind of turn the volume up and listen to that. So just putting those birds in the background really makes the scene feel more real and alive because there's some realistic sound effects in the background. Alright, so once you've set up the sound effects, we can now render this to a final video file. So I'm going to scroll right over here, and we're going to go to the output, and let's click on the file icon to set an output. And I'll go to the same folder with my other files, and I'll just call this final video, and then I will just click on accept. And then right here on the file format, because we opened this up in the video editing layout, the file format should already be set up correctly, but I'll just quickly go over the settings. So I like to use the FFmpeg video for the video, and then if I go down here, actually let's open up the color management, and you want to make sure that it's just using the standard color management, because if it's using the filmic, then it's gonna like gray out the image and it's gonna mess up the color correction. So just make sure it's set to standard. And then here in the encoding, I'm going to use MPEG-4. Also the video codec, I'll use H.264, and we'll use a medium quality and good encoding speed. And then if you do have sound effects, I like to use the audio codec of AAC. So then if you want to, you can save this video editing file, and then you can click render, and you can render the final animation. And here is the final animation. And so this is going to finish up the tutorial series. Now, one really quick thing that I did want to mention, in the final animation that I created, I did have a few different shots at a few different angles. angles. And I'm not going to cover how to do those other shots in this tutorial series because it really is just the same exact thing. You're basically just going to animate the camera, and you're also going to change the depth of field and kind of move it to a different area. But I will really quick just kind of show you where I set up the camera. So I'm going to go into the render view just to kind of see how it's looking. And for kind of that other shot on the side of the river, I kind of brought the camera over to like here. So you'll just need to delete the keyframes and then move the camera over. And you can also like edit the landscape and kind of make the landscape popping up. Also, if you want to, you could duplicate the landscape and put another landscape farther away into the scene. And then if you wanted to, you could also duplicate some of the rocks and put them in the river here. And then again, just animating the camera, I kind of had the camera move around the scene. And then I also added the noise modifiers to the camera. And then of course, if you move the camera, you'll also want to move the depth of field. So you can just move that empty object to somewhere here on the side of the river so that the camera can focus on it. And then also, if you move your camera to somewhere else in the scene, then you might want to use that same trick where you subdivide the mesh so that it is more detailed. So again, if I go back to edit mode, let's say I'm going to render out a scene and the camera is going to be pretty close to the side of the river here. You can go into edit mode and just select all those faces, and you can use the object context menu and you can just subdivide it. I could just maybe subdivide it twice so it's very detailed. And now you can see just that part is very detailed, but then farther away it is lower detail because we don't need that much detail farther away. So now you can see the river front looks very detailed. You can kind of see those pebbles. So this is going to wrap up this tutorial series. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the tutorial series. And if you'd like to show me your finished result, then definitely let me know in the comments. Now, sometimes on YouTube, if you send a link in the comments, sometimes YouTube will automatically remove it and I may not even see it. So you can also just comment and let me know where you post your artwork online, and I'd love to check it out. Or if you post your animation here on YouTube, then you can use YouTube's tagging feature, and you can tag me at Ryan King Art either in your video description or in your video title, and I'd love to see all of your finished animations. And if you enjoyed this tutorial series and you'd like to help support me and this channel to help me keep on creating these free tutorials, then definitely consider checking out my Gumroad store and my Patreon page and the YouTube memberships. But I hope you enjoyed this tutorial series, and thanks for watching.